Okay, welcome back. So we'll be starting our last presentations now. So go ahead, Carl.
Hi. Well, thanks for having me. It's putting a lot of trust in someone who has no credentials at all. I don't have a background in computer science, and that topic is kind of computer science-y. If I get stuff wrong, correct me later, and act like you didn't notice. Title was Present in a Cross-Browser Extension for Alma. Maybe it should have changed it to Pretending a Cross-Browser Extension for Alma. There is a cross-browser extension, and it does stuff with Alma at the very, very end. But it turned into something different than what it was when I started writing my proposal. Also, I used a lot of coulds in that proposal. If you go over it again, I didn't say that anything of that would actually work. Shout out to our marketing department. They have this nice template that I should use because of CI and stuff. But I only noticed that I should use that PowerPoint thingy after I made the presentation in Reveal.js. So that's the try to burn our logo into your retina and imagine it exists on the next slide. A subtitle, funny. So about our library, we're a teeny tiny library. We've got 4 librarians, 4 student assistants, making up a total of 4.4 full-time equivalents. We're there to serve 3,000 students, got about 35K physical items. And we moved from Arduino to Alma in August 2017, and I think it's either today or some time next week that we should be celebrating our anniversary of the library still existing with all the original staff. We also were the world's first Alefino library to migrate to Alma. Alefino is like Aleph's smaller, challenged cousin. The client looks the same. On the back end, it doesn't have an Oracle database. It's like a text block that you can actually grab for books and stuff by SSH. It was NoSQL before. That was cool. It's kind of an old product that's still used mainly in the German-speaking world, I'm thinking. So nobody had any idea how that would turn out. Migration tools were explicitly developed for us, and we were a super small team. I was all the functional experts in that process. That means I was not an expert for anything, nor functional. But stuff got overlooked, and rather unsurprisingly, that entailed some real-life surprises. Many of those were kind of self-inflicted. We didn't always mark orders as received in Alefino because there was no functionality attached to that. There was no claiming process or anything. And once we got our books out of the packages, we'd stick a barcode in and call it a day, right? But when those items got migrated to Alma, they were stuck in acquisition. And at that time, there was no job that could change the process type from being in acquisition to actually being on shelf. Alma wouldn't believe us that we've had these items for the past 11, 12 years. Also, then there's a story about a claiming job that we didn't know existed. And there was one fateful Monday when I came into work and phones were ringing, and we had vendors on there asking if we really want to get that book that they supposedly haven't sent 10 years ago. And they were asking if we were all right. And many of them didn't ask. They just sent their stuff. So now we have duplicates of books that nobody needs. Kind of hectic. But another thing that's nice when you have an ILS is actually being able to loan your items, and you can't loan items that are in acquisition. So we had to do something about that, and manually scanning 17,000 barcodes wasn't on the table for long. So I really wanted to play with the WebExtensions API. That's part of the initial motivation, right? And the only other option was PHP, because I had access to server where that was running, but it's PHP, and I didn't want to ask our IT for one of those Perl thingies or stuff that you're using. And then the browser can do gets and posts, right? That's all it does. And no JavaScript. So solve the problem with a custom Chrome extension, like a throwaway Chrome extension. You could drag and drop a CVS file onto the thingy. It would parse it and have a list of 70,000 barcodes. Go out and scan those in at a table. That worked. You could even download a log once it was done. But it did nothing else, except for showing me that maybe there's a promise it's promising to use web extensions to interface with such a thing as Alma. So why use them? 3 random reasons. You have access to client state of the web application that you're trying to manipulate. You have access to the server-side APIs. As I said, you can post and get to your heart's content. You have access to other tabs that are open inside of the browser. So you could think about integrating the web with Alma, like copy and pasting, but cooler in Amazon only. I don't know. Highlight an ISBN and make a search in Alma. And to some extent, you have access to some system resources like the clipboard, and you can even have global keyboard shortcuts. So you could have a keyboard shortcut that would open the browser, open the tab with Alma, and use whatever is in your clipboard at that time, and do something with that. Or, I don't know, sky's the limit. And it can be used without your IT department's cooperation or consent. Usually, I don't know if anybody has IT departments that use browsers where the option to install web extensions is disabled. At our institution, you can just do that, and you don't need admin rights because it's living within that browser. And they'd have a hard time convincing us that we're not allowed to do that. Although that's terrible security-wise. Web extensions can do so many bad things, and mine probably does too, without my knowing currently. This is not production ready. Maybe that came across. You can play with it, but beware. And browser-based tools are suited for browser-based software because of the tautology. I think that's clear as day. And I need to think Golem, which is kind of neat because we're in Prague. For those who don't know what a Golem is, it's a character that originates in Jewish folklore. It's an animated anthropomorphic piece of clay usually, and it's driven by words that you put in its head. And you use it to do menial tasks and stuff. So that made sense. Also, the pun at the end will make sense. And the most famous narrative with the Golem is right here in Prague in the 16th century. Involves Rabbi Löw. And that's the synagogue where, as legend has it, the Golem still lies in the attic, but you can't go and check because it's closed to the public. So we'll never know. My personal first experience with I know them from Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, and in there the programminess of the words that you put in the Golem's head is even clearer. He uses analogs with Asimov's robotic laws and stuff. Kind of when I was a kid and I read those books, that there's an anecdote that I'm not finding the words for. Made sense to me. And every Golem has these words in its head. Pratchett calls them gems. That's a transliteration fail. It should be SHM. In German, it's called Shem. So when I wrote the Lisp interpreter that drives the extension, I named my dialect Shem because that's like scheme, but if you squint at it, it looks like scheme, but then you notice something's missing, and it's fun. And it looks like scam if you read it in English, which I'll have to live with. Also in modern Hebrew, Golem supposedly means dumb, crude, unfinished, which gives you yet another layer of puns. So the goals of this thing. Use Shiny. I should start saying that while this originated at my work, the first iteration of Golem started there, but then I kind of took it home, made it my pet project, and started with the interpreter stuff, because that's not something that I get paid for. And this is why I get to use shiny new tech, because it's fun, like TypeScript, the latest versions, and I get to reinvent all the wheels as long as that's fun. And hopefully in the end I come up with something that's useful. I think it is useful today to an extent if you had the power to discern documentation that's missing, like magically from the code, and understand it, because you wouldn't be able to. Non-goals of this thing: speed. It's slow. You're not going to program anything. You're not making games with it, which is perfectly fine, because I wanted you to enable to just execute tiny snippets, tiny scripts that would do one atomic function, and maybe once in a blue moon you scan in 70,000 items, and that might take 10 hours, but you're okay with that because you're going to throw it away later. Or because you don't have any other option, like you're an institution like ours. Security, to some extent, is a non-goal, because security in web extensions is hard. If you're playing with that, maybe make a new browser profile. Don't do anything besides playing with Golem in it, and don't open your bank account or something while you're using that. Sanity, to some extent, wasn't. Then there's the developmental stages of the different golems. That was the first one. It's a visual metaphor. Right? It solved one particular problem, those 70,000 items. Then I thought, how could you generalize that and do a bunch of different things that you kind of hook together or enable? And the second iteration was more of a learning experience. Didn't do nothing. Last time I used JavaScript, jQuery was cool. In between I did a lot of other stuff, but not TypeScript and NPM. So many tools that can break. Third iteration. That already, the idea was to have a scriptable toolbox. That's the first time I have an interpreter in there in the Lisp. And I thought a very, very basic Lisp would suffice to just have those predefined functions, call them, and hook them up in interesting ways. There's a really good tutorial in Maker Lisp by some dude called Kanaka. And he starts with this basic thing, but then you get kind of hooked on that whole functional programming stuff, and then you want to go further with the generalization, and then suddenly you have macros and the whole functioning Lisp, and you ask yourself, why confine that to Alma? So the current design goal is something that enables me to make the original thing that I wanted to make, but from within user space. Like the thing I've ended up with is a user script manager, basically, but instead of JavaScript, you get to use Lisp. Show of hands, how many of you have ever written Lisp? Wow, how many did enjoy that? It's always just it kind of grows on you. I was skeptical at first, and I just picked Lisp because I thought inventing a new language or domain-specific language was dumb, and people have been doing Lisp since the 50s, and there might be some reason. Also, the interpreters are super easy to write, the parsers. But it does change how you approach traditional programming. Like JavaScript looks different now than it did in April when I started this thing. And it's showing in the code base. Just look. Those are links. It's right now it is on the web store. I've unlisted it because it has features in there that I built yesterday. has no logo and stuff. So if you go there now, you could play with it. I'll put it on GitHub later, like Saturday maybe. I'm pushing it off. That's my first open source project after 20 years of programming, so that's kind of a big deal for me, and I'm not entirely comfortable putting myself out like that out there. Live demos, because we had those are always working well, and today we've had great successes. How's the time? 15 minutes. How am I going to fill those? Oh, another show of hands. How many has anyone ever experienced someone who knows Lisp talking to you, at you about Lisp and preaching how cool it is? Has that ever happened? Did they convert you? Because it is cool. But it looks really weird at first. Lisp uses reverse Polish notation, so you've got the operator, the function call at the start of the list, and everything is lists in Lisp. It's a list processor. And the really cool thing about this is, well, first it's super simple. There's very few syntax elements that make up the basic language, and then you build on top of that with macros and shortcuts that are just syntactic sugar. But the basic idea can be brought across pretty fast, even to someone who's never programmed, or maybe it's even easier for someone who hasn't programmed and doesn't have all these ideas about traditional iterative programming in his head. But that thing is, we'll call the function multiply with the argument 7 and 6. That is an editor that comes with the extension. It uses the Monaco editor, like the editor that drives Visual Studio Code, which is pretty cool. And they made that available for free. But what you can't do in Visual Studio Code is evaluate the form that your cursor is at right now, currently. So this is a REPL. It can do interactive programming or conversational programming. You can type stuff and see what it does. Of course, these forms can be nested, and I have lists within lists, so you get a tree, and that thing gets read, and it's translated to an abstract syntax tree, so what your regular languages all end up in. This exposes the structure of the tree. And Lisp has this thing called homogeneity, so the data that the structures and code is data, and you can manipulate code and then do metaprogramming stuff with it. And those get evaluated from the inside to the outside. Smallest thing first. Shem tries to incorporate some features that are stolen from Clojure. Clojure is a popular Lisp dialect that's gaining velocity stuff. And Clojure has, besides lists, other collections that are useful, like vectors. They look like arrays and act a lot like lists, but while a list would get evaluated like this, I can't do that because one isn't a function, while actually it is kind of a function, but you can't invoke the number one with this. You could invoke the number one because that makes a lot of sense with a vector, and then it looks up the nth value at that thing, so that's 3. Looks pretty weird, but it's useful when you do lookup in nested structures. One of these nested structures could be that thing that's a map that's mapping the keyword to the string. So you can ask this thing get the keyword or the value for the keyword in that string. It has regular expressions because you can't live without those, right? and those work. They just look weird. You can define functions like this. And there's another thing that's nice about having such a really integrated development environment. It has access to the state of the environment that you're evaluating your code in. So now the symbol square is actually bound to something, and it will tell me that I could use square and call that function with something. But the power of Lisp comes from macros, or Lisp people will talk your ears off about macros. The general idea is because the code is structured in a very simple way. You can change how it's arranged or substitute stuff before you evaluate it. So there's another step of evaluation before evaluation where you don't actually evaluate. Yeah, well, makes sense. The effect being that you could have a macro like this, which takes a list and puts what's in the last part in the front, and then you can execute it, something that isn't actually a regular Lisp form that could be evaluated. You can look at what it does using macro expand. One such macro that's used in the closure world very heavily is that threading macro. It says, take the first thing and put that into the next function, take the result of that and put it into the next function, and so on and so on. So you can, instead of writing tons of nested function calls, you can write it in a way that's suitable for human consumption. And that will end up looking up for T2 in that nested structure. This is a FizzBuzz implementation that's kind of Lispy. You can stare at it for a while, but you might be able to guess what it will do. This actually creates a lazy vector. That's a thing that looks like an array, and you can take any number of elements out of it, and it will only realize those arguments. So it's not in my memory, but it's the infinite sequence of all FizzBuzz numbers, and you can say, give me 0 to 100, and then it goes and does that thing. A feature that my interpreter has is tail call optimization. So Lisp uses a lot of recursion, and you end up blowing up your stack if you do recursion loops. But the interpreter is intelligent enough to turn that, because the last thing that function does is calling itself. It doesn't have to do anything else. In that particular case, you can turn it and evaluate it like iteratively, as if it was a for loop. So you can call some 41 without your browser complaining. Evaluation in that language is, oh, that's too fast. Weird. Should take longer. No, this takes long. Evaluation is based on async and the wait. So every call to anything, every evaluation can take as long as it wants, which becomes useful if you do a GET request at some point. You say, get a value, and it's not coming from your memory, but from somewhere else. And if it takes 2 seconds, then it takes 2 seconds, and your whole program will just patiently sit there and wait for it to come back. You could also, while this is nothing is currently using that functionality, but you could do concurrent evaluation of stuff. Fetch 5 things, and when they're all there, do something with that. The core library, the core functions there aren't that many, but it has JavaScript interoperability, so every time a symbol has a dot in it, it instead looks for a JavaScript. In this case, it looks for a function, and it evokes that with this works. So you got access out of box to the whole browser API, and even to the APIs with the privileged APIs that you get in web extensions for opening tabs, closing tabs, muting them, bringing a window to the front or whatever. That works too. And you can kind of go back and forth between sham values and objects and JavaScript objects, which is necessary. You can also access JavaScript properties. So in that case, it looks up the title, puts it in window alert, or you can set them super tiny, but let's see a smiley face at the top. And now the thing that is unusual, I'm not sure if I couldn't find anything like that, but probably exists, and I'm just ignorant of what it's called, and that's why I didn't find it. So please tell me what it's actually called. But I'm calling them the foreign execution contexts. Like you can define a context where you want to evaluate stuff for its side effects, probably, using a query. So in this case, whoops. And that will define a context called AnyTab that matches anything that looks like a regular URL. And if I go back to the IGeLU page, now we're having problems with screen space, real estate. So for that, you probably won't be able to see it, but now I can evaluate the print function in AnyTab. It prints 42 and returns nil because that's what print does. It just has one side effect, doing something in that tab. And actually it did that in AnyTab, probably did it here too, because might be some other tab. And returns all those results in the list. So you can query multiple tabs and they come back with a result. Or maybe something happens in that tab. Like, is it still AnyTab? Yeah. You could prompt the tab and get a result back. So 3 minutes left. That's an XKCD comic. Whoop. It's relevant because there's always one that's relevant. And I can define a context for XKCD. Something that I'm not going over is that it injects modular content script, so only those functions that you will need will get injected. You don't have an interpreter in every tab that you try to do something in, unless you really want to evaluate the scripting language there. If you just want to call something or get a value from JavaScript, you can do that without incurring a huge overhead. But in this case, I'm injecting more features because I want to do more fun stuff, like adding a listener to an element and having a local state in that tab when I invoke that thing so that it counts clicks. Terribly useful. And it can also do can show a tiny REPL. It's this floating thingy, and that can evaluate anything. You can could, in theory, make your own. It's a shell. Make your own commands that do stuff and encapsulate functionality in there. You could also do that. That's a CSS property, and now everything is Comic Sans. Well, and that's even more comic-y. I don't know. 1 minute to go. So that means the Alma demo is. I'm not going to show that. Haha. Yes,
no,
the thing
do.
that you wanted to see. I'm sorry. I didn't keep track of the time. It would have. I wrote it yesterday, which is either proof of my bad time management skills or of the capability of that language. But what that thing would have done is when you sometimes scan in patrons' IDs and then they run away and the next one comes along, you scan his or her ID, and then you realize that person before did something terrible, you want to go back to that record, but you can't because we don't have the activity center yet. And that would have locked everything you put into that field, put it into a local storage field, and you could just have your own log of that there and look at it later and admire it. So that's like, could be called something that's a useful function or beginning.
Okay.
Release me.
Okay. No? Questions? Anybody? I have one.
Yeah.
Are you using a compiler generator or to create AST and so on, or?
No, it's my interpreter.
It
parses it manually and does all that
okay.
the hard way.
Wow. Okay.
Like, there's ClojureScript that I could have used, but not within a web extension. You can never call a JavaScript eval function because your code will get flagged. So you go and write your own eval function that's evaluating a general purpose programming language.
Okay. Respect.